Hey folks, Mr. Olson here. Let's do some econ. The topic of this lesson is the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve shows us the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. You already know all the analysis behind the Phillips curve from what we've already done so far with the ASAD model. In fact, I want you to think about in your mind for a second, what happens to inflation and unemployment when aggregate demand increases? So you can kind of, when in doubt, graph it out, graph this graph out in your brain and think about it. And if AD increases, the price level increases, which means there's inflation. And GDP increases, which means there's a decrease in unemployment. All right, so if AD increases, inflation increases, and unemployment decreases. There is an inverse relationship between those two indicators. And in general, that's what happens over time. Because in the economy, most shocks are demand shocks over time. You can see that looking at this timeline of US history, you can see that the unemployment rate tends to be high when the red line, inflation rate, tends to be low. And then as unemployment decreases, inflation tends to increase. It's certainly not a perfect relationship, but it's generally true over time. So why does this also make sense intuitively? Why do you think this exists? Why do you think that inflation typically is high when, inflation is typically low when unemployment's really, really high, right? Well, if unemployment is really, really high, there are many people out there who are looking for jobs, then there's going to be many people out there with less income. And if there are many people out there with less income, then there's going to be fewer dollars chasing the same amount of goods. Right? If there's fewer dollars chasing the same amount of goods, then price levels are going to remain low. Right? Whereas if unemployment's really, really low, you have lots of people back to work, you're going to have more dollars chasing the same amount of goods, which is going to cause inflation to kick in. So given that background, let's actually draw our Phillips curve. It's a kind of like our graph of inflation versus, of price versus quantities. It's sort of similar to the ASAD. Instead of price level on the vertical, we're putting inflation, which is the percentage of price change as opposed to a set price level. And then instead of GDP on the horizontal, we're putting unemployment, right, which is related to GDP. And then we've already established that this is an inverse relationship. So the SRPC, which is the short run Phillips curve, is downward sloping to show that inverse relationship. Right? What does this curve tell us? Well, all the different points on this curve tell us that when the economy is overheating, there is low unemployment, but really, really high inflation. So that would be like this red point on the Phillips curve. If inflation is high, for example, at like 5%, then unemployment would tend to be really, really low, for example, like 2%. And then as you moved along the curve, you can move into a different scenario. So for example, if you were in a recession, unemployment would be really, really high, and inflation would correspondingly be really, really low. For example, if you were in a severe recession, the unemployment rate might be something like 9%, and there would be low pressure on prices. So maybe the inflation rate would be 1%. So that's what the short run Phillips curve is showing us, the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Okay. What is going to happen if there's an aggregate supply shift? So if there's a decrease in aggregate supply and we have stagflation in the economy, stagflation means high prices and stagnant growth. What's going to happen to the Phillips curve? Well, think about it. You already know this, right? If there's an increase in unemployment and inflation, we can't move along the curve, right? Because the curve is showing an inverse relationship. So if both unemployment and inflation increase, then the curve must shift outward, right? Because inflation is going up and unemployment's going up. So therefore the curve's going to shift outward, right? And that's how we could show both an increase in unemployment and an increase in inflation. So when the aggregate supply curve shifts to show the same economy in the same place, to show the same change in the same economy, you would shift the short run Phillips curve to the right. What about the long run Phillips curve? Okay, so in the long run, we've already established there is no trade-off between unemployment and inflation, right? And that was represented by the long run aggregate supply curve. So too is the long run Phillips curve. In the long run, our economy is going to settle at that natural rate of unemployment. let's call it 5%. And it's going to be independent of price changes. And we already know this from the ASAD model. So using the Phillips curve to show the same economy that can be in one of three places at once, we're going to have a, long run Phillips curve that is fixed at the NRU, the natural rate of unemployment. Okay. It's vertical at the natural rate of unemployment. So let's draw these side by side. For some students, when we first analyze the Phillips curve, it's confusing to just draw another model. I highly recommend drawing them out side by this. In the event that you're doing an FRQ that asks you about the Phillips curve, I would still draw these side by side, because if you think through them together, then it's going to help you understand what's going on. Okay, so we've already established the economy can be in only three places at any given time: a recessionary gap, full employment output, or an inflationary gap. And as we can see in the ASAD model here on the left, this economy is at full employment output because the equilibrium GDP and price level is along the LARS. Okay. So this economy at the yellow dot is also shown on the Phillips curve by the yellow dot here. So these are both expressing where the entire economy is at. This is the ASAD model, this is the Phillips curve model, but they're both showing the total economy and where it's at any given time. And this Phillips curve is showing us full employment output. How do I know? Because we're operating along the long run Phillips curve. So that means we must be at our natural rate of unemployment. Let's show what happens on both graphs if there's an increase in aggregate demand. So let's say that government spending increases, which increases aggregate demand, shifts it to the right, and that would bring us to this red equilibrium point, which is showing an inflationary gap. Okay, and we already know what happened to unemployment and inflation based on the ASAD model. The ASAD model shows us that the price level increased, which is inflation, and unemployment decreased, because as GDP increases, unemployment decreases. So what happens on a Phillips curve model? Well, we started at this yellow dot and prices went up, which means we're moving this way along the Phillips curve, and unemployment went down. Okay, so we could show that same inflationary gap on the Phillips curve by showing this red dot here, right? This red dot is expressing the same idea as this. When we're in an inflationary gap, you have a dot along the short run Phillips curve to the left of the long run Phillips curve. Okay. Now let's try another problem. Go ahead and pause the video, see if you can figure out this one on your own, and then I'll go through it with you. So given this model on the ASAD model, let's draw a short run Phillips curve in the same spot, which is a recessionary gap. And then let's show what would happen if aggregate demand fell even further. So this is clearly a recessionary gap. How do I know? Because the short run equilibrium is to the left of the LARS. How would I draw that on the Phillips curve? Like this. We have a long run Phillips curve. We have a downward sloping short run Phillips curve. And we already know that unemployment is going to be really, really high in a recessionary gap. And if unemployment is really, really high, it's going to be beyond the natural rate of unemployment at the LRPC, which is going to be something like over here, right? And we could dot those over and show unemployment's high and inflation is low. So those green dots are the same thing. If AD falls, we're going to see a decrease in aggregate demand. So the recession is getting worse and GDP is falling more and prices are falling more. How would we show that on the short run Phillips curve? Well, unemployment is increasing and inflation is decreasing. So we would move along the short run Phillips curve out farther to the right to show a recession getting worse. Okay. What about this scenario? You can pause the video if you want to jump ahead and try it on your own, then I'll go through it. Really quickly, we can see here that this economy is at full employment output, yellow dot here. So our starting point for our Phillips curve is going to be a full employment output as well. We're going to put a dot where the LRPC meets the SRPC, showing full employment. And then if there's a decrease in aggregate supply, what's going to happen? So we have a decrease in aggregate supply. It's going to move us into a recessionary gap. However, because the AS moved, unemployment's going to increase and the price level is going to increase. This is stagflation. So what's going to happen over here? Well, because unemployment increased and inflation increased, the short run Phillips curve is going to shift to the right, okay, to get us to that green dot, which is a special kind of recessionary gap. Okay. So as you can see here, we're starting to establish a rule. When the aggregate demand curve shifted, we moved along the short run Phillips curve. Whereas when the aggregate supply curve shifted, we shifted the short run Phillips curve. Okay, let's try one more example here. We're starting in a recessionary gap. So we would draw the short run Phillips curve like so, showing higher levels of unemployment than the national rate of unemployment. And then if there is an increase in aggregate supply, we could increase aggregate supply to the right, bringing us back to full employment. And because AS shift, we know the short run Phillips curve is going to shift. What does the ASAD model show us? It shows us the price level decreased, which is a decrease in inflation, and GDP increased, which is a decrease in unemployment. So that must mean the SRPC must shift in to bring us back to that yellow dot at full employment. All right, so here's our old friend from week 1 of this class. It's the cow. And one of the slides I showed you was this very slide right here. That once you learn one cow, then you can start learning more and more complex things and see the relationship among different cows. This, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the best examples in our class. You know the ASAD model with a vertical LARS and an increasing SRAS. All the Phillips curve is an inverse of that. We have a long run Phillips curve showing full employment at the national rate of unemployment, and then we have a downward sloping SRPC, right? These analyses are inverses of each other, right? So all we're doing is building off of our knowledge that we already have. Okay. And again, let me show you just one more time how these graphs are speaking to each other. Both of these graphs are showing full employment output. Let me show you the rules that I expressed verbally on the last slide. When we have an increase in aggregate demand, we're going to move along the short run Phillips curve inward, and that red dot here is going to show an inflationary gap, just like this red dot here also shows an inflationary gap, where we have a higher level of inflation and a lower level of unemployment. Okay. And then if the AD shifts in, we move along the Phillips curve out here, showing a higher level of unemployment. So in an economy, we have two graphs showing the entire economy at once. These graphs are expressing the same ideas in different ways. We can see that when there's an aggregate demand shock, we move along the short run Phillips curve. What about when there's an aggregate supply shock? When the short run aggregate supply curve shifts, so too does the short run Phillips curve shift. So if we see a decrease in aggregate supply, that's going to show an increase in the short run aggregate supply curve. Okay. And they move in opposite directions. So if the SARS shifts to the left, then the short run Phillips curve, the SRPC, shifts to the right. Okay. Similarly, if we see an increase in the short run aggregate supply curve, then we're going to have a decrease in the short run Phillips curve. Why? Well, because prices and unemployment are going down, right? So the curve's got to shift in. Okay. So they move in opposite directions. If the short run aggregate supply curve moves to the right, short run Phillips curve moves to the left. If the short run aggregate supply curve moves to the left, then the short run Phillips curve moves to the right. Okay. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is I think I'm showing this. Oh, and then this is the last thing I was going to show here. This is the long run adjustment. So let's connect the Phillips curve to what we did last time with long run adjustments in the economy. Let's start at full employment. Then let's imagine that consumer confidence is way up and consumers start spending. That would give us an increase in aggregate demand and would move us into an inflationary gap shown by the red dot on both of these models. Okay. There we are as an inflationary gap in the short run. What's going to happen in the long run? In the long run, because we're in an inflationary gap and unemployment is really, really low, workers are going to demand higher wages. And in the long run, they will get higher wages. And when wages increase, we see a decrease in the aggregate supply, giving us a leftward shift in the aggregate supply curve to bring us back to that white dot, which is full employment output, right? And that's where we're always coming back to in the end. Once wages and resource prices catch up to the price level, we're going to get back to our LARS, okay? What does that look like on the short run Phillips curve? Well, when AD increased, we moved along the short run Phillips curve to this red dot here showing inflationary gap. And then with our long run adjustment, as AS shifted to the left, the short run Phillips curve shifted to the right, giving us a white dot back here at the national rate of unemployment shown by the white dot where the LRPC intercepts the SRPC. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is the Phillips curve. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back in class. Take good care.